Welcome to the Probate Nation. We're in the midst of a series of shows about the durable financial power of attorney. A power of attorney is a great disability planning tool and recommended by estate planners to avoid the cost of a court-supervised conservatorship. But that lack of court oversight sometimes results in intentional and unintentional misuses of the power, and disputes arise within the family over these alleged misuses. Often an important component in resolving the dispute is getting an opinion from a qualified medical professional as to the cognitive abilities and capacity of the loved one who signed the power of attorney. While several medical professionals may contribute to the evaluation process, a trained neuropsychologist is the one called upon to do the testing and provide a medical opinion. We are pleased to have as our guests tonight two neuropsychologists. They will guide us through the evaluation process and the necessary testing they do that allows them to form such opinions. Our first guest is co-owner of the Neuropsychology Association of Fairfax, where she is a clinical neuropsychologist and the director of training. She has worked in the field of dementia for almost 20 years and is currently a member of the Memory Disorders Program at Georgetown and Inova Fairfax Hospital. She is also on the board of directors for Insight Memory Care Center in Fairfax, Virginia. Our second guest also is a co-owner of Neuropsychology Association of Fairfax, where he is a clinical neuropsychologist and director of research. He is assistant professor of neurology at Georgetown University Medical Center and is the executive director of Washington Neuropsychology Research Group. In addition to his private practice, he has been qualified as an expert witness in numerous legal proceedings involving the impact of dementia on a person's ability to make reasonable financial and health decisions. Please welcome Dr. Cynthia Sullivan and Jeff Wilkins. Guys, thanks for coming back and visiting with us.
Sure,
again.
thank you.
Always a pleasure to see both of you. Well, I mean, one of the first things that comes to mind as we begin to kind of walk through the thought process of whether someone has the ability to actually sign documents is, as you have educated me, is to get into the idea of cognitive function. So Jeff, tell me, what does that mean?
Cognitive function merely is how a person thinks. So it is a person's ability to understand what's going on around them, what they're being asked to do, a person's ability to make themselves understood, to express themselves, a person's memory, and then what we call executive functioning, which is really the crux of the matter with respect to the show today. It is reasoning and problem solving and judgment, things like that.
Okay. Well, Cindy, what are some of the clues to the presence of some cognitive dysfunction?
Well, sometimes you'll find that a person is having trouble understanding what you're trying to tell them, or they're very slow to respond to you when you ask them questions. Maybe they're having trouble focusing. They can't seem to stay focused on the conversation, or they can't remember what you've told them. So they're repeatedly asking the same questions, or they're telling you things that they just told you a few minutes ago without realizing that they've already told you that. Other cues could be the fact that they're coming to you from a nursing home or an assisted living care. That might cue you into maybe there's some memory issues here or some problems with functioning. Or if you know that they have a substance abuse problem, or they've recently come out of the hospital, they've had a stroke or a heart attack, or some kind of infection could affect cognitive function. Or if you're talking with them and you're noticing that it's the wife or the son or daughter who's doing most of the answering to your questions when you're actually trying to speak to your client, that can be a cue that something's going on there.
So it sends up a little warning signal. Exactly. We need to investigate that further.
Right.
So Jeff, can a medical evaluation or opinion really address whether someone has the legal capacity to sign a power of attorney?
Well, capacity really means that a person understands the nature and consequences of what they're signing. So if you think about then a general medical examination, it doesn't give you all the information you need to answer that question. We might understand a little bit from a medical examination about whether a person has an infection of some kind or an illness that can be treated, but we don't get from those evaluations much about thinking. The internal medicine doc is not really trained to look at thinking to evaluate that. So in a lot of ways, we're not getting the information we really need to determine capacity from those assessments.
And we're going to get to that in a second about the progression of who looks at what and how it makes its way eventually to your office. But continuing that same sort of thought process, though, can this medical evaluation process, before they actually get to your office, tell us whether somebody is subject to being unduly influenced by a family member or other closest associate?
Well, again, it's the same kind of thing. With that, we're looking at, in some ways, a type of fraud if somebody's being unduly influenced. And we don't see in a medical examination the types of tests that would determine whether a person would recognize that fraud or have insight into it or know that they were even being taken advantage of.
Okay, okay. So, so I think you've talked a little bit about this, Cindy, but Jeff, what are some of the medical conditions that would typically trigger a concern as to somebody's capacity issue or their ability to be unduly influenced? What are some of those things?
Sure. Well, there are many out there, of course. The ones that we would think about, I like to kind of think of as more transient or temporary, and then things that get worse or are more permanent.
Okay.
The transient ones being things like infection, or somebody has a metabolic disturbance that affects their ability to function, but that gets cleared up in the hospital and then they're fine. Or they have diabetes and their sugars are way out of control, but then that gets taken care of and they're okay. Those are temporary things that certainly can affect a person's ability to think. They can become delirious with some of these conditions, but they can be treated. And as long as they're not trying to execute a document or be influenced during that period of time that they're not thinking straight, then they can probably go back to normal. Then there are the more permanent ones, or the ones that get worse over time, things like stroke, which may or may not continue to occur, but it definitely is something that even if it happens just once can, depending on the stroke, make a person incapacitated. Then there's the dementia. Dementia, there are multiple kinds that we'll talk about soon, and, but depending on the type of dementia and how severe it is, that person can have problems making judgments, may not have capacity or ability to resist undue influence, and then can in fact be unable to make decisions, and then that can get worse over time. That one, it's not going to get better for sure.
Okay, well, we're definitely going to talk about some of those ones that get that are not static, but they can get worse. Cindy, let's talk about, we started to talk about the progression of medical evaluation. Of course, you guys have trained me about how this whole process works, so I actually act like I know something, but let me ask you, the professional. So, what type of testing do we normally see the internal medicine doctor, who sort of generally is the gatekeeper to start this process? Right.
Usually the internal medicine doctors aren't doing any testing of cognitive function. Occasionally they'll do a short little screening measure. Okay. We'll talk more about that one in a minute. It's a mini mental status exam.
Yes.
But usually they don't do anything. If a patient comes in complaining about cognitive issues, or a family member expresses concern, or the doctor, him or herself, notices an issue, they'll refer to a neurologist.
Okay. Well, that leads us to the next thing, Jeff. Now, the neurologist is, again, in this sort of train of evaluation is the next person we show up. What is the neurologist really, what are they trying to test for? What are they looking to do when they show up in their office?
A neurologist may do a mini mental state examination, and that's called an MMSE for anybody who's looked in the records. And that's a very short little screen, and it's not very sensitive. Some of them will go a step further and do something called a Montreal Cognitive Assessment, or a MoCA.
Okay.
That's a step further, but it still is not a very sensitive tool. What they tend to then do is, if a person struggles on that test, they'll definitely send them for a neuropsych evaluation. If a person doesn't struggle, they may not really know what to make of it, because there are some limitations for those tests. Then what they also do, so they're not looking a lot at cognition, they'll send them to us for that, but what they do in addition to maybe a short screen, is they'll look at physical issues. They'll do structural analysis, meaning an MRI of the brain, to look for lesions that may be causing the problem. They might do EEG to look at electrical activity and see if there's an issue there. Okay. Labs, sometimes analysis of the cerebrospinal fluid. All of these things to try to say, is there something else that's causing a problem here, or are we really dealing with just a straight cognitive condition, maybe like a dementia or something like that.
Okay. Well, so now I'm going to come back to you, because I think we want to get back to this mini mental, because a lot of people place a lot of stock in that and think, well, they're definitely, you know, they're good to go because they score a certain number, and other cases they're not good to go and because they score a bad number. So tell me a little bit more about the mini mental.
So the advantage of the mini mental is that it is short and it's very easy to administer. It doesn't take a lot of the doctor's or the patient's time, and So that can be very convenient in giving some indication of what's going on cognitively. The problem, as Dr. Wilkin pointed out, is that it's not very sensitive. So if you have mild cognitive problems, you can get a perfect score or close to perfect score on this particular test, and it won't pick up the issues. And it does not assess the reasoning and the judgment issues that we're talking about today. It's not sensitive to that. So you miss a lot.
Okay. So again, Jeff, the mini mental is definitely not dispositive as to whether somebody has capacity or any of those the key things that we're going to get to.
No, no. We think of it as a screen, and a screen basically is something that can help us as one tool of many to determine whether maybe there's something going on, but it's not dispositive, and you would need a much more thorough examination to get the information you're talking about.
Okay. Well, let's get to the, what they've gone through those. The internal medicine doctors done their part. The neurologists done their part. We've accumulated a bunch of records. Where now they're over in your office because, which medical professional then are you the best suited as a neuropsychologist to really test for these issues about cognitive abilities?
Yes, the neuropsychologist is the person, that's our training. We're there to basically take a person into our office, find out all we can about them, from their family, from medical records, but then we put them through a series of objective tests that look at all different areas of thinking, and including many of the areas that we're talking about when we consider capacity or ability to resist undue influence.
So Cindy, let's talk a little bit about the components of the neuropsych evaluation. Tell me a little bit about what you folks, Jeff started to have that discussion. Would you continue that?
Absolutely. So we'll always review medical records. We want to get that information from the doctor's offices. We're going to sit down and interview the patient and family members. We're going to do these objective measures. So we're going to measure, assess attention and processing and learning and memory and their ability to make decisions, judgment. All of that is part of the neuropsychological evaluation.
Okay. How long does that normally take to do that evaluation?
It takes a couple of hours. You want to spend a lot of time in that interview because that background information is crucial. So we'll spend a good hour just talking, and then another, 1.5, 2 hours with the testing itself. Okay,
and you do meet alone with the patient.
We'll do that as well to get a sense of their own insight into their cognitive issues. Yes.
Okay. So Jeff, let's talk a little bit about how is the neuropsych evaluation helpful in sorting through a dispute where someone claims that someone didn't have the ability to sign a power of attorney or they were subject to undue influence? How would that neuropsych evaluation help us?
Sure. Well, as Cindy was saying, we look at all different areas of cognition. Some of the areas of cognition, like thinking speed or attention, they're relevant, but they're not as important with respect to the types of things we're talking about here. But the things that are important that we look at is, I mentioned before, executive functioning. We're looking at reasoning abilities, judgment, ability to understand what's happening, insight. These are the types of things that we measure. And we also, of course, look at memory. And if a person doesn't have the ability to remember something that was said to them, that's quite important when they're signing documents, or remember what they're doing or why they're doing it, that also is quite relevant in this case. So we're looking at the areas of thinking that are exactly what you guys are wondering about when you're trying to figure out, hey, is this person, do they have capacity to sign, or are they being influenced unduly?
Okay, so you started to mention this though. Is it common in your process of doing the evaluation to actually talk to the person about the decision that might be being presented for them to act upon, whether it's signing a will or a power of attorney, whatever? You actually get into a conversation with them about that?
Absolutely. Like Cindy was saying, we have to meet with these people independently. We try to talk to them. In a case like what you're talking about, we would want to talk to the person by themselves without somebody else there, so that we can see what they truly think. I've had many cases like this where when a family member's there, the person's looking to the family member to answer questions, or the family member's jumping in because they want a certain portrayal to be put across. In this case, we want to talk to the person, see if they have insight, see if they understand what's being asked. We want to know if they understand what they're even signing or what they have signed. So it's extremely important as part of the process.
Okay. Well, one of the things you mentioned that gets into some of the more permanent problems that people have, which will affect those executive functioning, is dementia. So I believe that's what my understanding from our discussion. So tell us, what is, it's a name that's thrown out there, but what is dementia?
The dementia basically means that a person has a memory impairment and then also a deficit in at least one or two other areas of cognitive functioning. And so memory's the kind of core of it, but then there are other areas of cognition affected. And these deficits have to affect a person's ability to function. Meaning that it's not just cognition in isolation. They're actually not able to do the things that they should be able to do in their daily lives.
Okay, so Cindy, what are some of the common causes for dementia as we get old? We're all getting older. Fortunately, we're getting older.
Right.
But what are some of the common causes for dementia as we age?
Some of the most common types of dementia are the ones that are going to affect capacity, and those are Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease dementia, and one called Lewy body dementia. These all have different pathologies, so if you were to look at the brain under a microscope, they look different, but they present very similarly in terms of the cognitive issues. And then there's another one that is less common but very important. It's called frontotemporal dementia, and it affects specifically the frontal lobe, and that's where our reasoning and our judgment comes from. So that can have profound effects on somebody's capacity, and it changes their behavior dramatically as well.
So that's definitely something you can see, and you can register that in your evaluation.
Very clearly.
Let's talk about, a lot of this leads towards decision-making capacity and evaluating those and the challenges you face. So Jeff, let's talk about some of those. Then what are some of the current challenges with an independent medical evaluation or on decision-making capacity?
Yes, when we're asked to do an independent medical examination or evaluation, right off the bat we know that there are opposing parties somewhere in there. So one of the biggest difficulties is, who do you believe? You're going to hear from one side, you're going to hear from the other. They're all trying to influence the outcome is, whether it's for good purposes or bad. They're there they have a reason to be there. And so you want to kind of find out where the person fits in the middle of this. So it's a little bit difficult to sometimes parse out what you want to hear. I mean, you want to hear everything, but what is actually the truth? That's one of the primary things. The other is the person, him or herself, they're going through, they're a person, they're living their lives. So they could be in the middle of a grieving process for having lost somebody, and maybe that's what's really contributing to the problems you're seeing. Or maybe they had a urinary tract infection. Sounds like no big deal cognitively, but honestly, people in when they come into our office, when they've had urinary tract infections, those can knock a person out cognitively. They can be very, they can cause delirium, they can cause a lot of confusion until they're cleared up.
And but that can clear up.
It can clear up, right? Yeah, and we just need to know when were the decisions made, and if they were made during periods like of bereavement or during infection, or if the person's abusing substances, alcohol, other kinds of drugs. And if they're not doing those things, maybe they're thinking fine. So we need to, those are the complications that arise that we need to consider.
And when we talk about independent medical evaluation, so just so our audience understands, that's really something that arises in the context of litigation, where the parties want to have this person evaluated, so they agree to have an independent person like yourselves maybe do an evaluation, okay, and that may be done at that particular point in time, and that timing may be relevant as far as when the particular act was taken that they're concerned about. But you're really independent if you do an independent medical evaluation.
That's correct.
So, well, let's talk a little bit, Cindy, about the move to the implications of dementia. Okay, we talked about what it is, but tell me, does dementia diagnosis really affect a person's capacity? The
answer is complicated. It can, but not necessarily.
You sound like a lawyer.
Yeah, I've learned a little from you, Richard. So it is complicated because a diagnosis of dementia does not immediately mean that this person cannot make decisions. Especially early on in the disease, it might be just the memory and maybe one other cognitive function that's affected, so maybe they're a little slower to process, but they can still sit down and reason through something and make a good decision. It's later on in the process. Unfortunately, these are progressive conditions and they do get worse. And so at some point, this person will become incapacitated, but initially, that's not the case.
Okay. Well, I mean, I know I actually saw that in real life with an elderly client of mine who was very sharp, but you know, you just had to go back and talk to her 2 or 3 times and explain it to her, and she got it. Okay, but you just had to be patient enough to let her give her a chance to process it. She still knew what she was doing. She just didn't want to make quick decisions. So, Jeff, let's talk about, are you able to form an opinion in the process of doing your testing as to a person's level of cognitive functioning based on a dementia diagnosis?
Usually we can. I mean, that's the whole goal in terms of IMEs.
Okay.
Now, I mean, as Cindy was saying, when it progresses, there's going to come a point where they don't have capacity. So we don't even get, for instance, severe dementias in our office because these people are vegetative, they're not responsive. We already know they don't have capacity. Even a moderate dementia, those people are pretty far along. What we usually see is more of the mild to moderate types of dementias, and that's where we're doing the testing to try to do exactly what you're saying and figure out, do they have the capacity or not? What are their cognitive deficits, and are they in the areas that would affect capacity?
So it becomes quite I guess, somewhat of a gray area because
it does.
Because and you don't progress overnight either. It's some people progress very slowly.
That's
true. I know you've told us that. So there is medication you can take that actually can slow that process down.
That's right. Yeah.
I know you've told us about that. Let's talk quickly about the independent medical report itself, Cindy. What is a neuropsychology independent medical report? What is that?
Okay, so that's when, like you were saying, there's some litigation involved, and so we come in as an unbiased evaluator. So we include all of the information at our disposal, all of the medical records, statements from family and friends, employers, anybody who knows this person about their functioning in daily life. And then we also include, of course, the objective measures. So we're going to look very closely at these cognitive areas and with specific focus on that reasoning, judgment, problem solving, the executive functions. And then we'll use all of that then to present in the IME whether we think this person has the capacity or not.
Okay. Now, Jeff, talk a little bit about can form you will, if you can, will form an opinion then in that particular report as to their capacity to do certain things?
Yes, typically that's what we end up with in our conclusion. Most of the time we can form an opinion about this from all the information that we have. We'll then let the attorney who hired us know, or both sides, or whoever hired us, the court, let them know, do we think this person has capacity or not? Are they subject to undue influence? The recommendations in the report then will follow directly from those conclusions.
And those are generally as of a particular date, so depending upon situation, it might be that condition existed for a period of time prior to that date too, is that right?
That's right, yes. I've done several evaluations in which I was being asked to look back and say, hey, did this likely exist back then? Or person made a decision 6 months ago and signed documents, but it was so clearly they were developing dementia 2 years ago, that kind of thing.
Okay. Well, look, this is there's a lot of great information here, and I want to ask you guys to kind of close out with some final thoughts about this whole process, again, because we're worried about people signing powers of attorney, and who don't have the capacity, and then those end up in litigation, and we spend all this money fighting over these things. So give me some final thoughts about how neuropsych evaluations can either head that off or otherwise can maybe help resolve those types of disputes. Cindy? Okay.
Well, I think it's really important to understand that there are times when a person might not have capacity, and sometimes the reasons for that are going to be temporary. And so we need to rule that out first and just say, if this is a temporary condition, get the medical evaluation to document that and the treatment that's necessary to have them clear back up again. And obviously hold off on any decisions during that period of time. And then versus the more permanent, like we've talked about some of these dementia conditions where the person is not going to get better, or a stroke or something that's caused some permanent damage. And in those cases, remember also that even in the early stages, in a dementia, of course, you might be able to still make decisions. And that would be different from something like a stroke where maybe that capacity is gone at this point.
Okay. Jeff, how about your sort of final thoughts you want to share with us?
Well, I guess I think one of the reasons that we're talking here is to try to educate attorneys about when to do these evaluations so that we can avoid even more expense. And what I mean there is, my feeling is you need to do these types of evaluations as soon as you might think that a person's going to be signing something and maybe there's a problem with them signing it. So rather than wait a few years and then try to go backwards and have someone like me come back and say, hey, 3 years ago, did they have dementia or not? That's a little harder. It's a little more of a gray area. Much easier if we know that a person there's a question about them. If they have that question, let's get them looked at medically. Let's get the neurology evaluation. Let's get the neuropsych done so that we can make decisions now about whether this person is going, should have or should not have signed documents, so that we can avoid maybe some of the more expensive litigation and the more confusing questions that come up later.
No question about it. Guys, listen, I want to thank you guys again for coming in and sharing all this great information. Great interview, some great information. It's going to be very helpful both to attorneys and for folks that are taking care of their loved ones. So again, thank you very much for this. A great service to the community.
You're welcome. It's our pleasure.
You're very welcome. You know, one of the most important matters to sort out in a family dispute over the use of a financial power of attorney is whether your loved one even had the legal capacity to execute the document, or was the unduly influenced to sign such a document. These are all legal questions, and in order to answer them, medical experts are often called upon to weigh in on the cognitive abilities of your loved one. What I learned from our guests this evening is that the testing and opinions of a neuropsychologist can provide significant insight in addressing these questions. But such evaluations are typically done in the course of litigation. Often this is long after the power of attorney was signed. If you have any question as to the cognitive ability of a loved one and he proposes to execute a power of attorney or any legal document, you may want to have that testing done prior to the execution of the document. Armed with such an opinion, this may serve to rebut challenges years later. This brings us to the conclusion of our show this evening. Hope you found it informative. And remember that replays of the show can be viewed on the Probate Nation website. On behalf of the Probate Nation, thank you for visiting with us.